Marjorie Taylor sat in the congressional hearing room, his navy suit jacket unbuttoned as he leaned back in his leather chair with that trademark smirk spreading across his face. The Ohio congressman had built his reputation on fiery exchanges and confrontational tactics, and today he was ready for another performance. Across the chamber stood Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative from Texas, her burgundy blazer perfectly tailored, her expression calm but her eyes alert. She had just finished presenting her amendment on voting rights protections when Jordan interrupted with a dismissive laugh that echoed through the marble halls of Congress. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife, and every camera in the room immediately pivoted toward him. His colleagues on the Republican side exchanged knowing glances, anticipating another one of Jordan's legendary takedowns. But what none of them knew, what Jordan himself could not have predicted in that moment of overconfidence, was that this freshman congresswoman had come prepared with ammunition that would flip this entire confrontation on its head. Before we dive into this explosive political showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible moments where political underdogs deliver knockout performances that leave the establishment speechless. This is the story of how Jasmine Crockett turned Jim Jordan's mockery into her breakthrough moment, proving that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. The tension in the House Oversight Committee had been building for weeks. Jim Jordan, as chairman, had been using his position to launch investigation after investigation, turning every hearing into a media spectacle. His style was unmistakable: aggressive questioning, theatrical outrage, and an uncanny ability to control the narrative through sheer force of personality. At 60 years old, Jordan had accumulated enough political capital and media savvy to intimidate most witnesses and silence most opposition. He had become the face of Republican investigation power, appearing on Fox News practically every night to trumpet his latest findings and attack his political opponents. His colleagues either feared him or followed him, and the Democratic minority had learned to brace themselves whenever Jordan took control of a hearing. The man had mastered the art of the political ambush, and he wielded that skill with ruthless efficiency. On this particular morning, the committee was debating a series of amendments to election security legislation. The Republican majority wanted to implement stricter voter identification requirements and limit early voting periods, measures they claimed would prevent fraud. The Democratic minority argued these provisions would suppress turnout among minority communities and working families. It was the kind of partisan battle that had become depressingly routine in modern Congress, with both sides dug into their positions and compromise nowhere in sight. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and political junkies who sensed that something dramatic might unfold. They were not disappointed. Jasmine Crockett had only been in Congress for 18 months, but she had already made a name for herself as someone willing to fight back against Republican attacks. A civil rights attorney from Dallas, she had won her seat by defeating a moderate incumbent in the primary and then crushing her Republican opponent in the general election. Her district encompassed parts of Dallas and its suburbs, a diverse coalition of Black, Latino, and progressive white voters who wanted a fighter, not a compromiser. Crockett gave them exactly that. She came to Congress with a background in litigation, which meant she knew how to build an argument, anticipate objections, and deliver a closing statement that resonated. Unlike many freshman members who kept their heads down and followed leadership, Crockett had immediately positioned herself as a vocal advocate for voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic equality. Some of the older Democratic members found her too aggressive, too willing to pick fights, but the progressive base loved her fearlessness. What made Crockett particularly dangerous to opponents like Jordan was her command of the facts combined with her ability to communicate them in plain language that ordinary people could understand. She did not hide behind congressional jargon or technical policy details. When she spoke directly to the people watching at home, explaining exactly what was at stake in terms that connected to their daily lives. This talent had made her a rising star on social media, where clips of her floor speeches and committee questions routinely went viral. Her communications team knew how to package her best moments for maximum impact, and the combination of her natural charisma and their savvy editing had built her a following that extended far beyond her Texas district. On this morning, Crockett had prepared an amendment that would restore early voting provisions that had been cut from the base legislation. Her proposal would guarantee at least 2 weeks of early voting in all federal elections, including weekend hours to accommodate working people who could not take time off during the week. She had data showing that early voting significantly increased turnout, particularly among Black and Latino voters who often worked multiple jobs or faced transportation challenges on election day itself. Her amendment also included provisions to increase the number of polling locations in high-density areas to reduce wait times, addressing the shameful images from previous elections, where voters in black neighborhoods had waited 6 or 8 hours to cast their ballots, while voters in whiter, wealthier areas breezed through in 15 minutes. As Crockett stood at her microphone to present her amendment, she could feel Jordan's eyes on her. She knew his game. He would let her speak for a minute or two, just long enough to identify something he could twist or misrepresent, and then he would interrupt with a question designed to throw her off balance. She had watched him do it to other Democratic members, particularly women of color, whom he seemed to take special pleasure in demeaning. But Crockett had been a trial lawyer before entering politics, and she knew how to handle hostile judges and aggressive opposing counsel. A bully with a gavel was nothing she had not dealt with before. She began her presentation methodically, walking through the data on early voting and turnout. She showed how states with robust early voting had higher participation rates, particularly among working-class voters. She cited academic studies, election commission reports, and testimony from local officials who had seen firsthand how early voting transformed civic engagement in their communities. She kept her tone measured and professional, knowing that any sign of emotion would be used against her as evidence that she was unfit for the serious work of legislation. This was the tightrope that women in politics, especially black women, had to walk. Be passionate enough to show you care, but not so passionate that you get labeled as angry or irrational. About 3 minutes into her presentation, right as she was transitioning to discuss polling location distribution, Jordan interrupted. He did not ask the chairman for recognition or wait for a natural pause in her remarks. He simply started laughing, a loud, exaggerated laugh that was clearly meant to signal to everyone in the room that what Crockett was saying was ridiculous. The laugh went on for several seconds, long enough that other Republican members started to chuckle along with him, creating a wave of mockery that washed over the Democratic side of the dais. Crockett stopped speaking and looked directly at Jordan, her expression neutral but her eyes communicating that she had expected exactly this kind of behavior. Jordan let his laughter die down, then leaned forward toward his microphone. His voice dripped with condescension as he spoke. "I am sorry. I apologize for interrupting the gentle lady from Texas, but I just have to ask, do you honestly expect this committee to take seriously an amendment that would mandate early voting when we all know that the real issue here is election security? You are talking about making it easier to vote when what the American people want is making it harder to cheat." He emphasized the word cheat and looked around the room as if inviting others to share in his assessment of her naivety. Several Republican members nodded in agreement. One called out, "Here, here," in support. The Democratic members sat silently, some looking down at their papers, others exchanging glances that communicated frustration but also resignation. This was classic Jordan. Take your opponent's argument, strawman it into something absurd, and then mock them for positions they never actually took. It was effective political theater, and it worked because most people watching at home would only see the short clip on the news, not the full context of what had actually been said. But Jordan had miscalculated. He had assumed, as he often did, that a freshman member would be intimidated by his interruption, that she would stumble or get defensive or lose her train of thought. He had done this successfully dozens of times before to other members. What he failed to recognize was that Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for exactly this moment, and she had prepared for it with the same meticulous attention to detail that she brought to every court case she had ever tried. Crockett did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned to face Jordan directly, and when she spoke, her words were measured but carried the weight of someone who had anticipated every angle of attack and had her response ready. "I appreciate the chairman's interruption, and I appreciate his concern about election security. Perhaps the chairman would be interested to know that I did my research before submitting this amendment, unlike some members who seem to form their opinions based on whatever they heard on television this morning." The subtle dig landed, and a few people in the gallery let out small laughs. Jordan's smirk faltered for just a second, but Crockett was not finished. She was just getting started, and what came next would become one of the most replayed moments of the entire congressional session. She continued, her voice gaining strength but never tipping into anger. "The chairman asks about election security, so let me address that directly. The chairman has spent the last 2 years investigating supposed election fraud, holding hearing after hearing, bringing in witness after witness, and generating headline after headline. And in all that time, with all those resources, with all that media attention, the chairman has yet to produce a single piece of credible evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. Not one verified case of a dead person voting, not one confirmed instance of someone voting twice. Not one proven example of illegal immigrants casting ballots. Nothing. Zero. Zilch. She paused to let that sink in, and the silence in the room was deafening. Jordan shifted in his seat, his face beginning to redden, but Crockett gave him no opening to interrupt. Now the chairman might ask, how can I be so sure? Well, I went back and reviewed the transcripts of every hearing the chairman has held on election issues. Every single one. And do you know what I found? I found a lot of accusations. I found a lot of innuendo. I found a lot of witnesses who said they felt like something was wrong, or they heard from someone who heard from someone that something seemed fishy. But when it came to actual evidence, when it came to proof that could hold up in court, when it came to facts that could survive even basic scrutiny, there was nothing there. Republican members started to object, trying to interrupt, but Crockett had the floor and the rules protected her right to continue. Jordan banged his gavel, but she spoke over it, her voice rising just enough to cut through the noise without sounding shrill. And I know something about evidence, Mr. Chairman, because unlike some people in this room, I actually practiced law. I stood in courtrooms and had to prove my cases with facts, not feelings. I had to convince judges and juries with evidence, not conspiracy theories I read on the internet. And I can tell you that if I had brought a case as weak as the chairman's election fraud claims into any courtroom in America, I would have been laughed out of the building. The phrase, laughed out of the building, was deliberate, a callback to Jordan's own mocking laughter just minutes earlier. The reporters in the gallery immediately recognized the parallel and started scribbling notes. This was the kind of exchange that would dominate the news cycle. But Crockett was not done dismantling Jordan's credibility. She had more ammunition, and she was going to use every round. The chairman mentioned what the American people want. Well, let me tell the chairman what the American people actually want, based on polling data rather than the chairman's imagination. 72% of Americans support early voting. That includes a majority of Republicans, Mr. Chairman. 68% of Americans think we should make it easier, not harder, to vote. 81% believe that waiting hours in line to vote is unacceptable and that we need more polling locations in crowded areas. These are not partisan numbers. These are not Democratic talking points. These are findings from nonpartisan polling organizations that the chairman could easily verify if he cared about facts more than he cares about scoring political points. She reached down and picked up a document from her desk, holding it up for the cameras. This is a report from the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan organization that studies election issues. It documents how states that have implemented the exact provisions in my amendment have seen increased turnout, no increase in fraud, and higher voter satisfaction. The chairman can laugh all he wants, but the data does not care about his laugh. The facts do not care about his mockery. And the American people who are struggling to find time to vote while working 2 jobs to make ends meet do not care about the chairman's political theater. The Democratic side of the committee erupted in applause. Even some of the more reserved members were clapping, energized by watching one of their own stand up to Jordan's bullying tactics. The Republican side sat in stony silence, with several members glaring at Crockett as if she had violated some unspoken rule about how freshman members were supposed to behave. Jordan's face was now fully red, and his jaw was clenched. He tried to regain control of the hearing, banging his gavel repeatedly and calling for order. But Crockett had timed her remarks perfectly. She had exactly 1 minute left on her time allocation, and she was going to use every second of it to drive her point home. Mr. Chairman, you started this exchange by laughing at me. You treated my amendment as a joke. You acted as if my concerns about voter access were frivolous or silly. But I want you to know something. I do not represent the same Ohio district that you represent. I represent communities where people have waited 8 hours to vote. I represent grandmothers who stood in the Texas heat for an entire day just to exercise their constitutional right. I represent working parents who had to choose between making rent and taking time off to vote. Those people are not a joke to me. Their struggle to participate in democracy is not something I find amusing. And if the chairman thinks that defending their right to vote is laughable, then perhaps the chairman should consider whether he is in the right line of work. The room exploded. The Democratic members were on their feet, applauding. People in the gallery were cheering. Republican members were shouting objections and demanding recognition. Jordan was pounding his gavel so hard it seemed like it might break. But none of that mattered because Crockett had accomplished exactly what she set out to do. She had taken Jordan's moment of mockery and transformed it into a powerful statement that would be shared millions of times before the day was over. As the chaos in the hearing room reached its peak, Crockett calmly gathered her papers, took a sip of water, and sat down. Her expression was serene, almost satisfied, like a trial lawyer who had just delivered a closing argument she knew had connected with the jury. Her staff, watching from the back of the room, were already on their phones, preparing to clip the exchange and push it out across social media. They knew they had gold. Jordan eventually managed to restore order, but the damage was done. He tried to dismiss Crockett's arguments, calling them typical Democratic deflection, and insisting that the hearing needed to get back to serious matters. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. He had been knocked off his game, and everyone in the room could sense it. For the rest of the hearing, he seemed distracted, less sharp in his questioning, almost like a fighter who had taken an unexpected punch and was still trying to clear his head. The vote on Crockett's amendment came an hour later. It failed along party lines, as everyone had expected. The Republican majority was not about to hand a victory to a Democratic freshman, no matter how compelling her arguments were. But Crockett had not really been trying to pass her amendment through the committee. She knew the votes were not there. What she had been doing was making a statement, setting a marker, and building her profile as someone who would not be intimidated by Republican bullying tactics. In that sense, the vote was irrelevant. She had already won the exchange that mattered. Within minutes of the hearing adjourning, clips of the confrontation began appearing on social media. The footage spread faster than almost anyone expected. Twitter users created the hashtag #CrockettDestroyedJordan, and it trended within the hour. On TikTok, younger users set her response to music, creating remix videos that highlighted her best lines. Cable news networks played the exchange repeatedly throughout the day, with political analysts from across the spectrum weighing in on what it meant for the balance of power in Congress. Progressive activists treated the moment as a rallying cry. Organizations focused on voting rights used the clip in fundraising emails, telling their supporters that this was what fighting back looked like. Democratic strategists started talking about Crockett as a future leadership candidate, someone who could help the party connect with younger, more diverse voters who were tired of cautious, poll-tested political messaging. Within 24 hours, Crockett had gained over 200,000 new followers on Twitter, and her campaign account had received donations from all 50 states. The mainstream media reaction was more mixed but still largely positive for Crockett. CNN ran segments analyzing how her legal background had prepared her for verbal combat with someone like Jordan. MSNBC featured her in an interview that evening, where she expanded on her voting rights arguments. Even Fox News, despite their usual alignment with Jordan, could not completely ignore the story. Some of their commentators tried to defend Jordan, claiming he had been unfairly ambushed, but others acknowledged that Crockett had scored legitimate points and that Republicans needed better responses on voting access issues. The conservative media ecosystem tried to spin the exchange in Jordan's favor, but they struggled to find a compelling narrative. Some claimed that Crockett had been disrespectful to a committee chairman and violated congressional decorum. Others tried to shift the focus back to election security and fraud, rehashing old claims that had already been debunked. A few attempted to attack Crockett personally, digging into her background and questioning her qualifications, but those efforts backfired as they made Jordan's supporters look petty and vindictive. For Jordan himself, the aftermath was professionally uncomfortable, but not politically fatal. He still had a safe Republican seat and a leadership position that gave him significant power, but the exchange had damaged his aura of invincibility. Other Democratic members, emboldened by Crockett's example, became more willing to challenge him directly in subsequent hearings. The fear factor that Jordan had cultivated so carefully had been diminished, and he found himself having to work harder to control the narrative in his committee. Behind the scenes, Republican leadership was reportedly frustrated with Jordan for allowing himself to be put in that position. They appreciated his willingness to be a pit bull on investigations, but they also recognized that his confrontational style sometimes created unnecessary problems. Some whispered that Jordan had gotten sloppy, that he had started believing his own press and stopped preparing as thoroughly as he once did. The Crockett incident was used as a case study in how quickly a political moment could spiral out of control in the age of social media. For Crockett, the moment launched her into a new tier of political prominence. She was no longer just a freshman member from Texas. She was now a national figure with a platform and an audience. Invitations poured in for her to speak at events, appear on podcasts, and headline fundraisers for other candidates. Progressive groups began recruiting her to campaign in competitive districts, knowing that her presence could energize base voters and attract media attention. But the attention also brought challenges. With higher visibility came greater scrutiny. Conservative opposition research teams began combing through her record, looking for anything they could use against her. Some Republicans in Congress started targeting her specifically in debates, trying to bait her into making mistakes or saying something that could be taken out of context. Death threats increased to the point where her security detail had to be expanded. The price of standing up to power was steep, and Crockett was learning that lesson in real time. Yet she refused to back down or moderate her approach. In subsequent hearings, she continued to challenge Republican narratives with facts and data. She introduced more legislation focused on voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic equality. She used her viral moment as leverage to push issues that mattered to her constituents and the broader progressive coalition. Some of her more cautious colleagues advised her to be careful, to avoid becoming too much of a lightning rod, but Crockett understood something they did not. The old playbook of playing it safe and hoping for incremental change was not working. Her constituents had sent her to Congress to fight, and that was exactly what she intended to do. The story of Jim Jordan laughing at Jasmine Crockett, only to have her response destroy his credibility, became a defining moment in that congressional session. It illustrated several important truths about modern American politics. First, that preparation beats swagger every time. Jordan had relied on his reputation and his bullying tactics, but Crockett had done her homework and crafted a response that neutralized his advantages. Second, that underestimating your opponents because of their age, gender, or race is a recipe for disaster. Jordan had made assumptions about Crockett based on her status as a freshman member and a black woman, and those assumptions blinded him to the very real threat she posed. Third, that in the age of social media, a single moment can reshape narratives and shift political dynamics in ways that were impossible in previous generations. The broader implications of the exchange extended beyond just these two members of Congress. The confrontation became a symbol for a generational and ideological struggle within American politics. On one side stood figures like Jordan, rooted in older styles of confrontational politics, relying on volume and aggression to dominate debates. On the other side stood people like Crockett, combining traditional skills like legal reasoning with modern communication strategies that leveraged social media to reach audiences directly. The clash between these approaches was not just about policy. It was about who would define the future of political combat and which tactics would prove most effective in winning public support. For voters watching at home, the exchange offered a clear choice between two visions of representation. Jordan represented the politics of grievance and obstruction, using his platform to investigate opponents and generate outrage, but offering few positive solutions to the problems facing ordinary Americans. Crockett represented the politics of advocacy and action, using her position to fight for concrete policies that would improve people's lives, while also calling out hypocrisy and bad faith arguments wherever she found them. The contrast could not have been starker, and millions of Americans made up their minds about which approach they preferred. The media coverage of the moment also revealed important dynamics about how political narratives are constructed and disseminated in the digital age. Traditional news outlets covered the story, but it was social media that truly amplified Crockett's message and turned a single hearing exchange into a cultural phenomenon. The clips were edited, remixed, and shared in ways that maximized emotional impact and viral potential. Younger voters who would never watch C-SPAN or read a policy brief encountered the exchange through their social media feeds, where it was packaged as compelling political drama. This shift in how political information travels had profound implications for candidates and campaigns, rewarding those who could create shareable moments while punishing those who clung to older communication strategies. In the months following the confrontation, both Jordan and Crockett continued their political trajectories. Jordan remained a prominent figure in Republican politics, still appearing regularly on Fox News and still using his committee chairmanship to launch investigations. But the invincibility was gone. Other Democrats followed Crockett's example and pushed back harder against his questioning, and he found himself on the defensive more often than he was comfortable with. Some political observers speculated that the Crockett moment had marked the beginning of Jordan's decline from political heavyweight to just another partisan bomb thrower whose impact was diminishing. Crockett, meanwhile, leveraged her newfound prominence to build a broader coalition focused on voting rights and democratic reform. She became a regular presence on national media, articulating progressive positions with clarity and force. Her social media following continued to grow, eventually surpassing that of many members with far more seniority. She introduced ambitious legislation, knowing much of it would not pass but using each bill as an opportunity to educate the public about issues that mainstream media often ignored. Her constituent services remained strong, ensuring that her visibility at the national level did not come at the expense of representing her district effectively. The story of that hearing room confrontation ultimately transcended the two individuals involved. It became a teaching moment about standing up to bullies, doing your homework, and refusing to be intimidated by power. It showed that one person, properly prepared and willing to take a risk, could shift a narrative and change the terms of debate. It demonstrated that viral moments, while often dismissed as superficial, could have real political consequences by reaching audiences that traditional media never touched. And it proved that in American democracy, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the gavel or the chairmanship, but rather a well-crafted argument delivered with conviction at exactly the right moment. If this story of political courage and strategic brilliance resonated with you, Make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another moment where ordinary representatives do extraordinary things to fight for their constituents. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that preparation, facts, and moral clarity can triumph over bullying and bluster. The next political showdown is just around the corner, and you will want to be ready when it happens. Stay engaged, stay informed, and never underestimate the power of one voice speaking truth to power in defense of democracy itself.